Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jamerica Ramsey, and I'm currently the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Law and Society. It's the scholarly arm of the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights. So we team to address issues concerning local, national, and international issues related to public interest, as well as society at large. So I just wanted to invite everyone that I see before me to our last day of our 3-day symposium. It's been a great week, and I hope that we finish on a bang. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Shay Mace, our symposium director, as well as our reviewing editor.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Jamerica, and thank you all for coming. Today we have a wonderful group of panelists, so I will get started with introducing them. To my left, first we have Myrna McCallum. Myrna is a true change maker, award-winning podcaster, and leading champion of trauma-informed lawyering. She is the host of the Trauma-Informed Lawyer podcast and acts as a subject matter expert on trauma-informed policy, procedure, and process. Myrna also offers training courses on trauma-informed engagement for leaders, policymakers, police officers, lawyers, and judges. She has also become a highly sought-after public speaker, and we're very happy to have her. Myrna has co-edited 2 publications, Canadian Law, Indigenous Laws, and Critical Perspectives, published by Can L2 as a criminal law open access ebook, set for release on March 28th, 2023, and Trauma-Informed Law, A Pathway to Healing and Resilience for Lawyers, published by the American Bar Association, which is set for release in April of 2023. Myrna received the 2020 Federal Department of Justice Excellence in Legal Practice and Victim Support Award, the 2022 Canadian Bar Association BC Aboriginal Lawyers Forum Special Contributor Award, and the 2022 Saskatchewan Ombudsman Game Changer Award. She lives in North Vancouver, British Columbia. Thank you for being here. To my right, we have Professor Ellman. Professor Daniel Ellman is an assistant clinical professor and the director of externships at Wayne Law. At Wayne, Professor Ellman teaches the Holistic Defense Externship, Judicial Externship, and Public Service Externship, as well as interviewing and counseling and professional responsibility. Prior to working at Wayne, he taught a sociology course on collateral consequences at the University of Michigan College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. Professor Ellman began his legal career as a trial attorney at the Bronx Defenders and clerked for Justice Bernstein on the Michigan Supreme Court. He received a BA from Dartmouth College, a master's in teaching from Pace University, and a JD from the University of Michigan Law School. We'll forgive you for that. And then via Zoom, we have Professor Heather Walter-McCabe. Professor Heather Walter-McCabe holds a joint appointment at Wayne State University Law School and Wayne State University School of Social Work. Professor McCabe began her career as a social worker at a high acuity pediatric tertiary care hospital in the Midwest, working with families whose children had significant medical needs. After law school, she directed a public health research program examining the impact of firearm violence in Indiana. She later served as the executive director of the William H. and Christine H. Hall Center for Law and Health at Indiana University, Robert H. McKinney School of Law, before joining the faculty at the Indiana University School of Social Work. Her research is done at the intersection of law, social work, and public health. Her research translates complex legal issues and research findings across multiple professions to make the information accessible for use by practitioners and advocates in improving population health. As a part of this work, Walter McCabe was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Public Health Law Teaching Fellow from 2014 to 2016. Most recently, she is a leading research examining law and policy impacting LGBTQ health equity and well-being. She has published in traditional peer-reviewed academic journals and law reviews, and has also been sought by media to explain core issues of public health policy. Walter McCabe serves on the executive board of the American Public Health Association, the board of directors for the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work Policy, and is a contributing editor to the journal Social Work. So with that, I will hand it over to Ms. McCallum.
Go to the one with the button. Awesome. Okay. Okay, hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I want to begin by saying thanks to Shay for inviting me and communicating with me and helping me get here from the west coast of British Columbia. I want to acknowledge before I start speaking that we're on the traditional territory of the three Anishinaabe nations, and the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi Indigenous peoples. I think that's really important. I just shared this framework with Shay about like how I interpret trauma-informed lawyering. And I think before I get into how these things connect to each other in the time that I have to present to you, I want to just share a piece from this article by Patrick Andrews. He wrote a feature called Lawyer as Healer, and he says that Warren Burger, who I think was a former Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, once noted that the first professions in society were the clergy who healed the spirit, which of course wasn't the case for my people, the doctor who healed the body, and the lawyer who healed the community. And since that time, there was another Chief Justice from the U.S. Supreme Court, Warren Burger, who said doctors still regain a high degree of public confidence because they're perceived as healers. Should lawyers not be healers? Healers not warriors, healers not procurers, healers not hired guns. And as I thought about this, I realized that for whatever reason and whatever time in history, there was this idea that in order for lawyers to be effective, we had to really like destroy people. Like we had to take people down, we had to diminish them, demoralize them. And I know that that's not the view of every lawyer, but I have a background in criminal law, and I can say certainly every time I came into that space, I saw lawyers conduct themselves in that way, because I think that they thought that if we can, you know, rattle people so much that they are completely dysregulated, they will then appear inconsistent, lacking credibility, lacking reliability, and sometimes they just completely give up and say nothing, like become totally silent, and then leave the witness box, and then the lawyer can say, I did my best job because I did. My client is now acquitted, or I got the conviction, or whatever it may be. And I realized back in like 2007, when I started my career, there was no conversation about trauma and how trauma shows up in the courtroom. Since that time, however, thanks to the work of folks like Sarah Katz and Dia Halder, who gave me the language of trauma-informed lawyering, I began to understand how it is that I had begun to practice law. A lot of my colleagues would characterize my way of practicing as being casual, being informal, being relational. But when I came across the pedagogy of trauma-informed lawyering that Sarah wrote with Dia Halder, I had the language that this is actually trauma-informed lawyering, because I understood that there is a way to get good evidence from people. There's a way to be able to act in the best interests of your client. There's a way to be an effective lawyer that doesn't necessarily require that we destroy people, that we shake people up so bad that they leave our legal processes feeling completely dehumanized, right? And so this whole framework, this trauma-informed lawyer framework that I have put together, some of it borrows definitely from Sarah and Dia's work, But a lot of it is really drawn from my experience as an Indigenous woman, particularly the piece on cultural humility. Why? Because some of the folks I saw do the most harm in courtrooms were people who had no understanding of the people that they were actually engaged with. They had no understanding. It was either straight people who had no understanding of queer people. It was white people who had no understanding of people of color. It was like all of these different, like just disconnections where people could not see beyond their own lived experience to understand that folks who were not like them, who did not come from the sort of privilege that they came from, were having a completely different experience. And so I'm of the view that if trauma-informed practice is the left hand, then cultural humility is the right. Why do I prefer cultural humility over cultural competence? I think cultural competence is more of a, it's like a one-sided sort of framework. What have I read? What have I watched? What have I learned that now positions me to work with you who is the other? Whereas cultural humility, like trauma-informed practice, is a relationship-based framework. It calls on us to commit to a lifelong practice of learning and engaging from a place of humility and authentic interest in whoever it is that we're working with. It requires us to confront our biases, to reflect on our behaviors, to really question what we know and what was the source of that knowledge. Is it ill-informed? Was it racially biased? Is it toxic education? And a lot of that, you know, I draw from my experiences as an Indigenous woman who went to residential school. Like in America, they call them boarding schools where they put Native Americans. My country, it was residential schools. And no one taught about residential schools in Canada. And so now we're going through this process of sort of like recovery where they're finding burial sites at the former sites of these residential schools. And so Canadians are like, oh my God, what? Indigenous children died at these institutions. Well, yes, we've been talking about that forever. And it wasn't until there was evidence, physical evidence to confirm it, that people are waking up going, oh, what? And so I just feel like if there is a gap in understanding and a gap in accepting the truth of somebody's lived experience, there has to be a commitment from us as lawyers to really begin to explore just how limited our worldview is and just how privileged our worldview is. And what don't we see? Because we've never had to look through the lens of a person of color, a queer person, a person living with disabilities, and the list goes on and on and on in the ways in which we tend to other. And so I wanted to just flag the whole cultural humility piece for all of you, especially if you're less familiar with that concept. I want to also just note that the cultural humility framework was developed by two Black physicians in Los Angeles, Dr. Melanie Turvalon and Dr. Jan Marie Garcia. They came up with this framework after witnessing the beating, not just the beating of Rodney King by a number of white police officers, but after their acquittal. Every one of them was acquitted, and they started to think about, well, how do we bring justice, fairness, and equity into the healthcare profession? Because we all have an obligation, regardless of profession, to bring justice, fairness, and equity into our spaces. And so for those of you who are already like, ooh, cultural humility, this is interesting, go to YouTube. They have a series of videos on there that explain exactly what this framework is. But I want to just quickly comment on trauma to say, you know, for anyone who listens to the Trauma Informed Lawyer podcast, you know that I criticize law schools all the time for not preparing me for all the trauma I was going to confront in the practice of law. As a criminal lawyer, but also as an adjudicator, I adjudicated Indian residential school claims for a number of years. So I had to sit with survivors and hear stories about being tortured, about being put in electric chairs, about witnessing homicide, about not just sexual abuse and not just physical abuse, because I think that that broad language doesn't do justice to the kinds of things that I had to hear. And I just was not prepared to hear all of that stuff and to be the one who's pulling the story out of people. I had no education how to hold space for people, how to why safety is important, why psychological safety is important. I didn't even really have empathy, because part of my motivation for going to law school was because I wanted to be in a disconnected, dehumanizing profession. Why? Because I had been traumatized as a kid. I had a lot of childhood trauma. I didn't want to deal with it. And I thought law is the perfect place for me. And I really think I'm not the only one who's attracted to law for that reason, right? Because we're not ready to go and do that inner work. So we're like, let's be lawyers, because it really upholds being an asshole, and hell, it awards us for being jerks, right? So we're like, that's the place for us. The problem is our profession like suffers from like poor credibility. We have a poor reputation internally and externally. Our mental health outcomes, not good, right? The way people view us, not good. And so how do we improve this? I think that we need to commit to learning how to have relationships with people that allow us to prioritize their safety and ours. We need to start having conversations about boundaries with each other and with our clients. We need to become friends with the word no. We need to be okay to hear no, and we need to start to be okay to say no. We need to start asking questions like, what don't I know, but I should know, as we start to work together. We need to become acquainted with just simply admitting we don't know everything. And like, I think we need to commit to lifelong learning, because there's way too many folks in this profession that feel that they need to be experts in everything and never ever say, we just don't know. And as far as trauma goes, I mean, we need to understand what trauma is. Trauma is, as I understand through like listening to Gabor Mate and being in conversation with him and reading Bessel van der Kolk and Peter Levine and Thomas Hubel and all these others, is trauma is the thing that people carry with them. It's the pain, horror, and fear that continues to live inside people as a result of a traumatic event. And that traumatic event can be anything. It could be a big event, it could be a little event. But as Gabor has said, sometimes it's the thing that didn't happen, but should have happened. The protection you should have gotten, but didn't, the attention you should have gotten, but you didn't, the love you should have gotten, but didn't. That can create a trauma that you now start to carry through life. And so if you are operating from a place of pain, horror, and fear, well, then you can bet that you are functioning from a place of fight, flight, or freeze. And for many people, especially people in their 40s and 50s who start to like do the healing work that they've been long like avoiding, suppressing, they're like, oh my God, I thought that was just my personality to be scared all the time, or I thought that was my personality to just be angry all the time. And then they realize, no, that's just your trauma response masquerading as your personality. So why is this important for us to understand trauma in these terms? Because when people come to you with their legal issues, you can bet they're going to come with fight, flight, freeze. And I think a lot of us have a real problem when people come with a fight response. It tends to create a trigger in us where we want to react to somebody's rage with a rage of our own. But this is where like the important work of developing self-awareness, self-regulation, self-critique, self-reflection. How do I learn to regulate myself so that when people show up with rage, I can meet them with compassion and empathy? Because it's never about us. So a lot of this is not only calling us to start to do our own healing and inner work, but it's also calling us to cultivate things like humility, empathy, compassion, patience, understanding. It's also calling on us to learn how to take our ego out of the work that we do, because it's never about us. When someone is screaming at you, yelling at you, accusing you of something, being suspicious of you, that's just not about you. They are indicating to you, I don't feel safe, I don't feel safe, I don't feel safe. So what are you going to do? You need to learn, we need to learn how to prioritize safety, because I think safety is everything. I think in some way, we're always asking that question, am I safe with you? Am I safe in this conversation with you? Am I safe in this space with you? Everyone's asking themselves that question. I really think at the end of the day, to be a good lawyer, we need to prioritize this experience for all of our clients, all of our colleagues, everyone we're in relationship with, that we see them and we hear them. And so how do you learn how to do that? I think you learn how to do it by understanding trauma-informed lawyering will allow you to give people that experience. And I have found, regardless of the outcome that people are hoping for when they go through a legal process, if they feel seen by you and heard by you, that's everything. Because for many of those people, they don't get any of that validation. They don't get any of that acknowledgement. They don't get any of that compassion. They don't get any of that. So if you as lawyer can offer that to your client, I think this is how we start to change the narrative, the stereotype, the idea of who lawyer is, away from the gladiator, the destroyer, and back towards this idea of lawyer as healer. And I've been talking a lot, and there's more I can say, but I only had like 20 minutes. I think I'm done. I'm going to just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Next, we have Professor Ellman. So let me get his slides up.
Well, I first want to thank Shay and Jamaica and JLS for having us. It's been such a great few days of panels. And I actually mean that as a compliment to us because they save the best for last. So you're all welcome for being here in the snow. But it's been a great couple of days and we're honored to be a part of this. So I think I'll pick up where Myrna left off, and I appreciate the critique or even frankly criticism of what's taught in law school, because I think we have an obligation as professors, as teachers, and as students to educate ourselves in trauma-informed learning, because ultimately, like Myrna mentioned, this is not about us, it's not about me, not about you. It's about the clients that you're going to serve, and so we have to learn how to do that in the right way. So I thought maybe what we do today is, since it seems like there's a lot of law students in the room, I thought maybe we would take what we've been learning for the past couple of days and apply it, and as if this was class. So we are going to do that. You thought it was a lunch break, it's not. We're going to look at a type of lawyering called holistic defense, which is a type of trauma-informed lawyering. We'll think about how it's practiced, how it has trauma-informed elements, and what you can take away from that to be your own trauma-informed lawyering, whether it's in holistic defense or any other type of practice. I would ask if that's okay with you, but it is okay with you because I have the podium, so that's what we're going to do. Okay, so here's what we'll do today. 3 things. 1, how does a holistic defender practice trauma-informed lawyering? How can you figure out if you want to be a holistic defender? And then I will ask you if you want to be a holistic defender at the end. So we'll go back to how we always do things in law school, which is a hypo, of course. And for those of you on Zoom, you're included in this. So if you're watching TV or checking your email, I will call you in a minute. I want to ask a few questions. So get ready. So here's the situation. You're a public defender. You meet a client for the first time in arraignments, and they're charged with selling crack cocaine. I'll paint the picture a little bit more starkly for you. Let's say your client was arrested within the last 24 to 48 hours, right? What might have happened to them is that they were arrested on the street. They might have been taken to the precinct where they were booked, maybe questioned, and then they were brought to a criminal courthouse where they'll appear at this thing called arraignments. For those who aren't familiar, it's often when the charges are first read to a person. The case can end that day, or bail can be set, or the case can continue thereafter. Importantly, though, what your client's doing now is, or has been doing for the past couple hours, is sitting in a cell with about 10 to 15 other people. And then they're brought right in front of you, and you'll meet them right here, possibly between bars, possibly not. There's maybe a corrections officer sitting right there, and you're going to have about a 10 to 15 minute conversation with them before you go in front of the judge. That's sometimes how it looks. So that's what you're confronted with now. And my first question to you is, so after introducing yourself to your new client who you've not met, they don't know you, what's the first question you ask them? Hold on. I'm glad to see participation. That's great. But I have more. What else do you want to know after that first question? And what will you do with that information? So why don't we do this? Now, I want you to take a minute and talk to someone if you're in the room, who's next to you about these things. And if you're on Zoom, you can talk to yourself, and then we'll come to you in a minute. Yeah, 1 minute. All right, why don't we bring it back together and see what you all thought. So I really don't like cold calling. I'll take volunteers if that's preferable. All right. Would you be able to volunteer for the first one? Yeah. What's the first thing you have?
I'll ask them about it.
Why would you do that?
Because if they're the select faculty, and they would love to employ hard results, and they might not be at a place where they have the physical treatment or anything. And I think that if I jump straight into figuring out what's the case and stuff like that, but the more the fact that I was the person in front of something very traumatic.
So I think there was a lot there, and I really appreciate that answer for a few reasons. One is, I think the thing that you said at the end might be the most important thing is, look, you're sitting in front of a real person who's been through a traumatic experience, whatever that was, knowing nothing else. You know that they've been taken off the street, brought into a police station, and now brought here in a really tough environment, right? You don't need to know anything else. Any person who meets someone like you as their lawyer hopes that you care about them, just to say, hey, I know it's been tough over the past 24 hours. How are you holding up? How are you doing? Right? That's it. Something you ask someone on the street, like, hey, how's it going? You should certainly ask it here when you know what they've been, right? You say something else, you know, they may have experienced trauma either in that moment. They may, you say, be an addict. We don't know that necessarily, but they may have been through things in their life that have been traumatic, right? And one of the things you need to understand is, where is that person right now, emotionally, physically, mentally? So when I ask, how are you doing? If you're really elevated, if I sense something that's going on right there, I know that that conversation is not going to continue in any productive way until I can relate to you, get you down to a level that we can talk at a normal level at, right? And if you're too emotional or upset to get there, that's understandable, but none of the rest of it matters until I can assess where you are and how you're doing, right? So let's just understand from a lawyer's perspective, what do I need to do to create a productive conversation in the next 10 minutes, right? And the third thing it might do is, when you ask that question to a lot of people, what you'll get is, hey, where are my kids, right? And that's like a fight or flight response. Their answer to you is often the most important thing that they care about in that case, which is, hey, where are my kids? I don't know. I haven't seen them 24 to 48 hours. So you as a lawyer now know two things. One, you have to address that, because they're going to be thinking about their kids the whole time for the next 15 minutes, unless you talk to them about that. And number two is, as you go forward with this criminal case, it might affect their family and the custody of their children in many ways, right? So that should be at the forefront of your mind, because it might be at the forefront of your client's mind, right? So put yourself in your client's shoes as much as possible and understand where they are and what's important to them. That's a great first question. I think should always be the first question you ask in some form. Okay, what else do you want to know? Yeah.
We talked a bit about, like, what are your most pressing needs right now? So if somebody is perhaps, like, if they don't show up to work, they're gonna risk losing their job. If they need to contact a family member, or, you know, there's could be a multitude of things that are pressing issues that they need dealt with before they can think about their legal case.
100%. You want to know everything else that they didn't tell you when you asked how they were doing. Literally everything else about their life, because all of it matters to them, right? We think that people come in here caring about not going to prison or jail or probation or getting fined, right? Because those are the traditional criminal penalties. Certainly that's true. No one wants that, right? But at the forefront of a lot of people's mind and life is their kids, their job, their house, their immigration status, right? And that's what holistic defense is. It's recognizing that people come into the system for a lot of reasons, and once they get there, care about a lot of things, not just criminal penalties. So it's your job as a lawyer, once you build that foundational relationship, to ask about immigration status, family, kids, house, because that's going to inform everything that you do for them. Another thing to think about is, if I just came up to you and started asking about your kids, your immigration status, and you don't know me from Adam, like, are you going to answer? Why would you answer that question, right? Who am I? I'm a public defender. You've never met me. You probably think we're terrible, right? Because that's what the image of public defenders are. And you don't trust, you don't know, you're not paying for me. Someone just handed me to you, right? You don't know who I represent. So it's not clear at all. You have to find a way to ask those questions in a way that someone's actually going to open up to you when they understandably may not trust you. Right? And then the question is, okay, now you've asked a lot of questions, gotten a lot of information. What are you going to do with it? You're the lawyer, right? They're coming to you for help. So what do you do with all that stuff? They tell you that they care about all these things in your life, in their life. What do you do then? Here's one criminal defense lawyer, Aaron. And for those of you in the holistic defense program, I see some of you are online, and Aaron, I hold you to a higher standard to answer these questions. So yes.
Basically see like what you can do independently. So if there's a family member you can contact, do that. But then, you know, if there are external, like external issues that don't fall within your particular realm of criminal defense, consult with people who do practice in those fields like immigration, family law, and just kind of try to figure out how best to help them.
100%. Myrna mentioned our limitations, right? Knowing what your limitations are. There's only so much you can do as a criminal defense lawyer, right? You can identify issues like immigration, family, housing, mental health, substance abuse, but you may not well be trained in that, right? So then bring in people who are, because it's your obligation to represent your client in all of these ways, but it's also your obligation to say, hey, I don't know that well enough, right? I mean, look at the experts we've had in this symposium for the past few days. Lawyers, social workers, mental health counselors, judges, right? All of these different people are experts at different things. So don't put it upon yourself to do all the things, although you should be doing all the things, right? And there's another thing, right? When you ask a question like this, you're going to get a lot of information, and that should guide your representation of your clients. But it's also coming upon you. You should be careful about what you ask for. If you ask into someone's life and they tell you about a lot of trauma, that's going to land on you. And if you do it over and over and over, this is not the only client you're talking to at arraignments. You've got 10, 20 clients today. You've got 100 back at your office. Well, you're all asking these questions to, right? That's a lot to put on yourself. So we heard about the idea of vicarious trauma in the past couple of sessions. What is this doing to you? Because for anybody, when you hear about someone else suffering, most people feel upset about that. Just naturally, you don't want to hear about someone else suffering, right? If you have past traumas, hearing about someone else suffering can trigger those things, right? And like I said, if this happens over and over and over again, it will get to you. And it honestly should, if you're really thinking about it. So when you ask the question, how are you prepared to deal with that personally? So I think there's kind of two things to think about when you get information. What are you doing with it strategically? And what are you doing with it personally? So I'll just mention, these are my thoughts on law school. You know, I don't know if you share this, but I think law school goes really quickly, right? First you're 1L trying to survive your 1L classes, then you're applying for 2L jobs, then you're applying for 3L jobs, then you're taking Barnes over, right? That's kind of how it works. So it's really hard to take a pause and figure out, like, what am I doing here? Why did I come here? What am I getting out of this? So as much as you can, Try to take that time. I kind of think of law school in kind of three parts: getting experience, getting knowledge, and doing some self-reflection while you're there, right? In terms of getting experience, I can talk to you all day and we can do a million hypos about how this might look, how you might practice. It's not helpful unless you go do the work yourself. At some point in law school, go out there and see how you react to someone sitting across from you like that and asking those questions. Because I can't tell you, I don't know you, I'm not you. So everyone will react in a different way. So go out there, clinics, externships, internships, jobs, whatever you're going to do to get that type of experience. Knowledge, you can get that from the field, you can get that from your classes, you can get that from symposiums, but put yourself out there into different fields and see what inspires you. That can inform the experience you get in law school, but it can also build the knowledge you'll need to get when you're a practicing lawyer. And self-reflection. I personally don't do it enough. I will admit that. Try to do it as much as you can. It can be through sessions like this, like talking to your friends while you're cooking or whatever. Just take a minute to be like, wait, why did I come here? Am I doing that thing? Do I feel inspired by the stuff that I'm doing? I think it's important to take that moment because you should be doing those things when you get into practice too. And this is a good place to start. I just put the Holistic Defense Program on here as an example, which is a Wayne State program. It tries to incorporate all of those things. You working at a placement, doing the work, and you taking two courses that try to surround you with the type of thinking that you need to have when doing at least holistic defense. So now I ask, is being a holistic defender for you? You can't answer that because you haven't done the work yet, but I will tell you there's three answers. I'll tell you right now. There's yes, no, and I don't know. Those are the only three possible answers. Yes, no, and I don't know. And they're all equally good ones. If you go out there and you decide, yeah, you know what, I want to be a holistic defender who practices trauma-informed lawyering, I will say, are you sure? Are you sure about that? Have you thought through all the things that comes with? The limitations you have. You can do the best job in the world, and you may not fix someone else's trauma. Probably you won't. Are you okay with the fact that you may not be able to change the immigration laws that result in your client being deported potentially, or the family laws that allow your child to be taken away after some time, right? You, as a singular defender, you may not be able to change that in the day-to-day. Are you okay with that kind of practice? If yes, great, go out there and do the work. But just go in with an eyes wide open. No, you know what? I don't like being a holistic defender because it's just too much for me. That's fine. Okay. Or you know what? There's someone else on the other side of this case, a victim, a complainant, and I don't see myself representing a client who's been alleged of something like that. If that's what you come to, that's okay too, right? Maybe you decide you want to be a prosecutor. You say, you know what? The people in this room who have the power are the prosecutors. I'm going to go over there. I'm going to be a prosecutor because I want to think in a trauma-informed way as a prosecutor, not a defender. That's a great thing to come away with too. I don't know. One of the best things we can, I think, say and admit. And so if you come away saying, I don't know, that's great. What are you struggling with? What aspects of this practice are you thinking about that give you pause? And what kind of experiences can you have in your time here at law school or going forward that help you decide the kind of lawyer you want to be? Because ultimately here at law school and for you as students, I think that's kind of the ultimate question. What kind of lawyer do I want to be? Not in terms of a transactional lawyer, criminal defense lawyer, like who do I want to be as a person when I sit across from a client? That's kind of our obligation, I think, as professors, and hopefully what you come away from law school having a better understanding of. Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Ellman. So next, and finally, we have Professor Heather Walter-McCabe. So I will ask her to go ahead and unmute herself and take it away.
Good afternoon. I first of all want to apologize for not being with you all this afternoon. I am a newbie Detroit snow driver and decided that I had a ways to come and I did not feel comfortable making the drive. So for those of you who are there, thank you so much. I want to acknowledge that you likely had, I am not up there, but acknowledge that you likely had to work to get there today, and apologize for the fact that I am not there with you. I want to thank Shay and Jamaica for the invitation today. I really appreciate being here. And I also want to thank the first two speakers. I actually did my slides before listening to your amazing presentations, and you may see me moving a little bit from the slides because I want to respond and react to some of the great information that we just heard, because I think it's very applicable. I think as we listened, we heard ideas about some critiques about how we teach in law classrooms, particularly in regards to who we are and how we meet students as they are. And so as we move forward, I want to talk a little bit about that. At the beginning, I do want to acknowledge, in addition to our keynote, whose work I certainly relied on for what I'm about to say, the work of three scholars that I specifically consulted their articles and information for this. Sarah Katz, who I realized does have an H at the end of her name, but Sarah Katz, Victoria McCoy Dunkley, and Malika Kerr from the Sikh Family Center, all of whom have written some very nice information about really thinking about how we might approach trauma-informed care in law school classrooms. Some of the most recent information has been written because, or as a result of, some of what we're seeing in the classrooms as we've gone through the COVID pandemic. And it's not as if students have entered the classroom with trauma only since the pandemic. I think some of the shifts we're seeing are how many of our students at the same time are exhibiting some of those hints to us that they are in fact experiencing trauma. And I think sometimes people think of trauma only, and I talk about this when I'm talking from my social work side of my brain, which I must admit does often cross paths in a very good way with my law brain. There's that big T trauma and small t trauma. And sometimes professionals, even as well as us as individuals, we think that the small t trauma, things that wouldn't necessarily, when we say it out loud, make people do the whole kind of response, isn't as important. And while it's different, it doesn't mean it's not important. And what we're seeing as students come in to us through the pandemic and before, where we may or may not have noticed it as much, are students with loss. We're seeing students losing family, friends, including things like losing jobs and their normalcy. What was normal, whatever their normal was, it's now different. We're seeing students who are in isolation. We tend to talk about pre, during, and post-COVID. I would submit that we're still seeing lots of impacts of COVID even now, even as we are going out of the house more. And it has not necessarily meant that everybody's back from that feeling of isolation that they experienced when we were in our house more often. We're seeing students with increased financial concerns and increased caregiving duties. Even now, it's not over in that respect. And when we talk about what a trauma-informed classroom is, the phrase that I most often hear, and I think have been reflected in the talks you've heard today, are places where students feel safe, seen, empowered, and connected. So what does that mean? What can we do? I will say it's somewhat daunting to do this talk in front of former students, because one of the things I will start with is, while I strive to do these things in my classroom, I'm not there, whatever there is. And I think that fits somewhat well with the idea of that cultural humility. I too prefer cultural humility, and we actually speak and teach specifically on these issues in social work. And I've never really liked cultural competency, because there is this idea that at some point you really can fully understand and be competent in someone else's culture. And I guess I just don't subscribe to the belief that that will ever be the case. I feel like I will constantly be learning. I will constantly be listening, and I will sometimes get it wrong. And I think that the more that those of us who teach in the classroom understand that that's going to be the case, not just in terms of what we might define as culture, but even in terms of how we might be thinking about how we getting there in terms of having a trauma-informed classroom, perhaps that will free people to not feel that perfectionist tendency, and therefore not even try. Because it's really important to acknowledge our students. And so we actually have had, I've had some folks say, as I've talked about some of the approaches I use, should we even do this in our classrooms? And I think in some ways that goes to what Dan was talking about, asking yourself in practice, what questions am I asking? Because when I ask them, I'm going to get the answers. And when we ask in the classroom, I tend to teach smaller, 35 to 40, or even seminars where I have 10 to 20 students. We have some faculty who are teaching extremely large classes. What do they do with all of this information? And one of the things that we know for the medical literature is we often ask doctors to speak about social determinants of health with their patients. And we learn by listening to the doctors, they don't ask. Why don't they ask? Because they don't know what to do with it when they hear about it. And so what we found was having things like medical legal partnerships or a more robust social work department where doctors, if they get this information, have a resource to refer patients to. That change got them to ask the question. So why am I going down that path? Because I think that as we think about more robustly implementing this in our law classrooms, we need to think about what resources are there for students. Do we have them? Because if we ask these things and we leave professors in a position where they get this information and there's nothing they can do, which by the way, we may also need to become comfortable with, we may see people more willing to implement this kind of thing in the classroom. I think where we usually hear about it being implemented is through our clinics, and for good reason. If people are working with clients, I think it's critically important that they have this learning and that they have this modeled for them and their professors. But even in the doctrinal classroom, there are ways we can do this. So what kinds of things can we do? Well, I think acknowledging the difficulty of these times. Professors are also human. We've all gone through this together. Now, the whole, I'm not going to be able to tell you where the quote came from. Clearly, this is not mine, but the whole notion of we may all be in the same storm, but we're not in the same ship is certainly true. But universally, I think we can talk about there has been some difficulty for folks, and just making that clear at the beginning of your time with students that we do acknowledge that they're going through this. Being sure that we are creating a positive classroom culture. What does that mean? Well, sometimes in classes, we are going to be talking about legal history, current legal concepts, current systems of justice that may not be so just, where we're going to come across something that can be upsetting. One of the things that I try to do, and I would recommend to folks who are doing more doctrinal classroom, is thinking about having a set of classroom rules or agreements that are set out from the beginning, and not just rules that you as the professor put forth and say, these are our classroom rules, but rules or agreements that you create with the students in the classroom, where you talk about what happens if someone in the classroom says something that creates a response in you that is upsetting, often reasonably, usually reasonably. How do we want to handle that? Do we try to speak to the other person directly first? Do we do it in that moment? Do we do it after class? Do we go to the professor? What if it's the professor? One of the things I invite my students to do, which I do think it goes back to one of the things that Dan said about, if you ask a person about their immigration status in the first couple minutes that they meet you, do you have enough of a relationship that they feel comfortable coming to you? I do think that can be something that could come up if you invite students to do this, in terms of being a faculty member. Do you have the relationship they feel comfortable? But when we go through these rules, I explain to my classes that they apply to me too. That I come with all of my background, all of my culture, all of the things that I need to unlearn, all of the things that I don't know about cultures that are different than mine. And that what I often say is, I can promise I will never intentionally say something that is harmful, but I cannot promise that I may say something that's impact is harmful. And if and when that happens, I need to correct it. And I invite students to come to me for it. And if they don't feel comfortable doing that, that they can go to student services or elsewhere to make sure that they get what they need if I'm doing something that's impact is harm. Different folks are going to have different rules about that. But I think that having some kind of conversation about how this space and our time together over our months together is going to be a place that is positive so that real learning can occur, even as we're trying to navigate the difficulties in our lives, as well as the good things, is extremely important. One of the other ways that I've tried to do this in the classroom, and there's some literature on how to do this, if you're interested, I do have some resources at the end, is when there are traumatic events in the news, are we checking in with our students? For example, the Michigan State University shooting. It's close by, so whether or not people knew people impacted, this is a trauma that is close to our university that may well have had an impact on many of our students. We know that it did. I teach a class in sex, sexuality, and the law. I teach public health law. I teach pandemic law. We're often talking about laws around LGBTQ plus issues. And as we've seen very difficult things happening at the state level, I will often check in with the students and say, how are we doing this with this? We're going to be talking about it today. What do we need to do? Sometimes with better effect than others, I will admit, because I also have bad days, right? And sometimes being honest about that is okay. But checking in and offering resources when they're available. I don't require students to come to me if they're having difficulty to get the resources. I will often say, here is where you can access campus resources. And if you have any difficulty, please come to me. But so these are things that we can think about. I also think that we need to think about the goals for different classroom rules, like due dates, class participation, other things like that. Due dates are there for a reason, right? They are often there. I often use it for this reason. If you don't get it to me by this date, I'm not going to have it graded in time for it to do any good for the next assignment, or I'm not going to get your grades in time. Some of them are extremely hard due dates, because if you don't get it to me by this date, I won't get your due date to the registrar and you aren't going to be able to graduate on time. That's a hard due date. Are there due dates where we can have some flexibility for life that happens? And we don't often talk about that in law school, particularly. I've taught a lot of different schools. Some schools have much more stringent thoughts about things like due dates. What about class participation? Do we allow at least one, maybe two, no questions asked passes for no cold calls? If we don't, do we have a good reason for that? Maybe we do, and that's okay. But if we don't, is there a way that we can allow students to bring their whole selves to class, including those days where they just cannot get the reading done for whatever thing has happened in their life? And we can allow for that, but still allow them to be there in the moment with the rest of us. So thinking about those goals. The other thing that I think is really important, and I think one that may be more difficult, certainly both of our speakers have mentioned this in terms of our work with clients, but what does it mean for faculty or other teachers to be continually assessing our comfort with issues students may encounter? When we talked about all people having some kind of trauma that they bring with them, that isn't all people except faculty. How do we take the time and the energy to think about how what we bring with us might impact how we respond to a student in crisis? And so I think it's important for us to continue to have these conversations. I won't say that we haven't had them at all, but I think that ramping that up and making it something that is central to how we approach our teaching of law students is important. Because the other thing that happens through that type of teaching is we are modeling the behaviors that when people go into a clinic or into their practice, they've seen modeled by people who are teaching them the law. And so I think that that's important. We talked at the very beginning, one of the things I mentioned was creating a space where students feel safe, seen and heard. And as we think about how we can make that happen, there's a lot of things that go into it. We just talked about some of them, but one of the ways that we can do that is to see them and to listen to them, which sounds ridiculously basic, but so often there's so much content to get through, so much that we need to do. We get to the lectern and we start discussing the knowledge that we need them to get. And so making sure that we think about how we want to do this in our classes, and if we want to do this in our classes. Because for those who are not at the place where they are ready or able to assess their own comfort in the ways that were well discussed prior to my arriving at the podium, then perhaps it's better for them to not yet until they get to the point where they feel like they can. But for those who are interested in doing this, I think it's important. And the other thing that I want to discuss is this idea that we heard discussed of, am I safe in this space with you? And asking, are we as faculty members asking ourselves, are our students safe in this space with us? If we're trying to discuss some of the laws that are out there that are bringing up systemic issues of racism, of homophobia, of religious, of ethnic, the problematic in a systemic nature, have we created an environment where students truly feel like they can discuss these things? Because one of the things that happens in the classroom is we can allow students to have the opportunity to speak on these things, to kind of put it on the table. What are they wondering about? How are they thinking about it? Because being able to do that in a classroom where they can say things and find out, gosh, when I say this, no matter my intent, this is the impact. In a classroom, they can learn. With a client, they certainly can learn, but they're learning on a client. And so are we creating a space that's safe enough for students to be able to do that in our classrooms? And so I'll end there, and I'm really hoping that folks have some questions about this, because there's a lot to say about it in a short amount of time. But there's some really good information about this out there for folks who are interested in learning more. And I've put three different, the first two are more traditional journal articles about this. There's certainly the amazing podcast that our keynote speaker does. I think that would be really informative. And then there's the Law Support Academic Support blog, or excuse me, Law School Academic Support blog has actually created a blog specifically on trauma-informed teaching that might be of use. And I certainly invite others. I know that our audience today is a lot of students, which is really fantastic, and I'm glad you're here. And if there are other faculty members, other teaching folks, and just anyone who wants to discuss what this might look like more in a classroom and work together on something like this, I invite you to contact me, because I do think this is something that it's going to take some of us who are trying to do this and making the mistakes as we do it and trying to get better at it, to have these conversations. I welcome anyone to contact me to have those conversations. And I want to thank you again for having me here today.
So with that, I will open it up to any questions, whether in the audience or in the chat, or if any of the panelists want to say anything further. Yes.
I appreciated what you're saying, Ms. McCallum, about how the adversarial system sort of inherently is not trauma informed. And that really spoke to me, because I feel like it took me a long time to decide to go to law school, just because I held on to ideas that like lawyers are jerks. And so I guess like what my question is does it seem like there's a slow but sure like sea change happening, where we are starting to like return to the idea of like lawyers as like a sort of healer, or is it still too pervasive that lawyers are just kind of like a toxic element?
Okay, well, thanks for that question. I mean, I'm seeing it, and maybe I'm seeing it because these are the conversations I'm having everywhere I go now. But I mean, the fact that the Trauma Informed Lawyer podcast has over 100,000 downloads across the world tells me that more and more people are tuning in to understand why it's important to bring humanity back to a profession that has long been dehumanizing. And it's not just for the benefit of the client, it's for our benefit. Right? It's for the benefit of the judiciary. It's for the benefit of everybody. And yeah, I mean, I'm incredibly hopeful. Every time I get called in from law schools, I will show up, even if I have to cross the country in horrible weather. I will show up, because I really feel that law students are like the hope for the future. I'm hearing law students and new lawyers saying, okay, this old way of doing this thing didn't work for you, because like look at who you are and look at what kind of inequity, inhumanity you've upheld, and we don't want to be part of that. We want to center mental health and wellness for everyone. We want to center boundaries. We want to center safety. We want to center humanity, humility, empathy, and compassion, and that's what we're going to do. So yes, I'm seeing it, but change is slow, especially in this profession.
If it's okay, I'm going to follow along with that, because absolutely agree with what you're saying. And one of the things that I say to my students a lot is I often get invited into a room because I have a JD after my name, and I often get asked to stay because I have an MSW after my name and those social work skills. And I think the more we're doing this kind of work, the amazing work that both of the folks in the room with you are doing, we are going to see that change. I think in the chat, we had a question about students becoming lawyers, becoming professors, perpetuating deficiencies in our profession. Are there ways to break the reinforcement of bad practices of trauma and sensitivity on a non-individual way? And I think that the conversations that are taking place, those downloads of the podcasts, are all important. And I think that we are seeing, like, over the years that I've been, since I've graduated, I'm seeing an increase in, for example, medical legal partnerships. I know that's the second time I brought it up. Holistic defense clinics, where we are seeing people working together to try to break some of these norms in our profession that have been well described in the speakers prior to me. And so I think all of that will over time change. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is policy change in legislation and regulation. And I think one of the ways that we can continue to push this in a more systemic way on the profession is by thinking about the way we make policy and how we are including community in our conversations, not just the legal or subject matter experts, but bringing the what I view as the true experts, community members who are impacted by policy into the discussions. And I think if we have to start practicing law in a way that includes people who are impacted by what we do in the very creation of the systems, that may also drive some of this change, which is a little bit different than trauma-informed lawyering per se. But I think that it is in the vein of including those who have experienced the trauma from the systems themselves in making those changes to the system. So I don't know. I will say, I think over the time that I've been doing this, I will echo what was just said, that I'm seeing improvements. We're not there yet, wherever there is, but I am seeing these changes take place. And even in some of the law classrooms, there's more conversations being had about how we can think about how we're teaching in new ways. So, and I would be interested certainly in hearing the other speakers' experience with that, if they would say that that's not the case, but that's been my experience.
Agree with all of what's been said, and I think a lot starts with professors and the folks that are teaching, but I think a lot of it starts and will continue with you as the students, because you're the ones who are, number one, going to be the new lawyers, and number two, you tell us what you want in your education, right? I think a lot of legal education can be reactive to what you want, and I think the holistic defense program, just as an example, is a good one, because when we started this program, we didn't know how much interest that there would be. And it turns out there's a tremendous amount of interest in the program. And what that means to us as professors is this is something that you value as students, that you want to learn more about. A credit to this symposium. This is an entire symposium about trauma-informed lawyering. And I think, I don't know why you chose this, but I think you maybe chose it because I think you think it's important to your classmates, right? So you can see the reactive ways in which we're responding to what you want. So go out there and tell your professors what you want, do the things that make it clear what you want to do, particularly if it's this kind of stuff, trauma-informed learning, because I think that the profession will react to that.
I did just want to say one thing to that. One of the main reasons that I did choose this as the topic for our symposium was because in my own personal life, having survived a lot of trauma as a child and substance abuse and being in the system on the other side of it, compassion and humility were two things I did not encounter when I was a defendant from my defense counsel, my own defense counsel. And I was actually propositioned by my public defender while I was in jail. So, you know, that was a long time ago, but I know those issues do still persist. And, you know, part of me wanting to come to law school was to be able to share my experience, because I have a unique experience from being on one side of it, and now, you know, hoping to create change in a broad way. And talking about these things is the first step in doing that, I think. And we had one comment here from Alex Zeherder. Targeted universalism also includes the idea of inviting those affected by systems to the decision-making table, which I think is a beautiful statement. And we do have one more question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you all. As somebody who's hoping to graduate in May and be hired by a public defense office, these are things that I think about a lot, and large reason why I want to go to law school. And I think
at least from my limited experience working in a public defender's office, is I guess the thing that I'm most nervous about is trauma-informed lawyering requires a lot of effort and a lot of resources. And so what does that practically look like when public defenders, office I'm hoping to work at, you know, one of my friends works there, and within a year, she's going to have had 150 cases. So how do you implement these skills and learning techniques that take a lot of effort while also being able to do that in a high volume? And so if there's any, I think, advice about balancing the realities of what it looks like to be a public defender, and still prioritizing doing that before.
Yes, I think all of that is true. And that is the reality of the situation. Caseload should be lower. And that is a systemic thing that someone here in this room or on Zoom is going to change. But in the meantime, I think it goes back to recognizing what you can do and what you can't do, right? So you can answer all these questions about mental health, substance abuse, family, right? But saying what I can do right now is this for you. I'm going to try to find another expert that can help me with that. And some things you will just not be able to do, right? And that's okay, because you can only do so much, right? So you prioritize, you allow someone else to help. I brought in social workers all the time because I didn't know how to deal with stuff, right? Or if you don't have a family defense lawyer in your organization, or there's not an immigration expert, refer them out and say, this is the best I can do for you right now. Get the advice that you need and come back to me, or you consult with them too. So I think that's the reality of the situation. There's just limits.
I'm going to add to that, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
So I'm a former prosecutor, and I mean, what I want to say, if I could just shout out the cultural humility framework again, because I could just like go on about that forever. There's like an institutional accountability element to it, which I really love. So yes, individuals, we need to change, but we also need to change the systems within which we work, because failure to do so really just upholds inequity, inhumanity that exists within those systems. And I mean, what I would suggest to you is look for opportunities to educate the court and your colleagues about trauma. Have conversations about the vicarious trauma risks that exist within that work that you do. Begin to have conversations about boundaries. Like every year, at least when I was a prosecutor, we would have to do like CPD, like CLE, whatever, like continuing education. They'd have ideas about, well, who do we bring in to do training? And it's usually like the evidence-based folks to talk about like psychopathy and all kinds of things that we how to, you know, find indicators of deception, etc. I think we need to bring in people who can talk to us a little bit about boundaries. Why is it important for us to begin to say no and to respect no, to embrace this idea that no is a full sentence? I can't do more. I need to rotate out of sex assault cases and maybe into impaired driving because I've had too much exposure to this. Maybe like this is my caseload. I cannot take one more thing. Or I don't know how it works here in Michigan, which is, I had to just check to see where I was, in Michigan. But like where I used to practice, we would go into like smaller communities and hold court. And it was a regular practice for a long time for the judges to say, okay, well, if we have to stay here till 8 o'clock at night, we're going to stay here. And when you're the prosecutor, you're the one standing speaking to every case, but you've got defense lawyers coming and going. They get the break that you don't. And so eventually what we saw was lawyers saying, no, like if we didn't get through the docket and it's 5 o'clock, then too bad. We're leaving, like we're done. And so it's a lot of saying no. But what I understand, at least in Canada, and I'm sure it's the case here in America, that the courts don't know enough, and leaders who appoint prosecutors and all of they don't know enough about trauma, and specifically how trauma impacts people who make up the legal profession. So the more education information we can provide them with, this is how we create systems change. And so you need to be that voice, unfortunately, and not just you alone, hopefully, but like demanding education for the collective. This is where it begins.
Any other questions?
All right, well, our time is up. So thank you all again. Thank you to the panelists. I cannot explain my gratitude to everyone and to all our participants, those virtually and in person. So thank you all. Have a great day.